Here we are in part 5 of this series, analysing the history of Magic the Gathering by looking at a card from every set. Today we're going to look at the graveyard-centric Odyssey block and the tribal-focused Onslaught block. Let's get down to it. So with the Weatherlight saga over, where would Magic the Gathering's story go next? Well, for the next two blocks, in other words all the sets that will be covered in this video, we received a brief story arc about the pit fighter Kamahl and his quest to bring down the evil Cabal. Yes, it is slightly confusing that the protagonist is named Kamahl, and that sounds almost identical to the word Cabal, which he's fighting against, but let's go with it, okay? This story is unofficially known as the Mirari saga, because it centres around a magical artefact known as the Mirari. The first of the two blocks comprising the Mirari saga was Odyssey block, which began, appropriately enough, with the release of Odyssey in October 2001. Magic the Gathering has several of what are known as graveyard sets. Sets which encourage you to fill up your graveyard with cards in order to get various benefits and bonuses, whether that's as simple as using the graveyard as a resource to resurrect more powerful creatures, or as complex as a mechanic like Threshold, which we'll talk about in a minute. You could make a case for Weatherlight being the first graveyard set in the game. I talked before on this programme about how Weatherlight cared about the order of cards in your graveyard, but the first graveyard set, as we know the concept today, which laid the groundwork for future sets like Amonkhet and Innistrad, was Odyssey. Odyssey's Graveyard Matters theme is demonstrated by the two mechanics which the set brought to the game, Threshold and Flashback. Cards with Threshold have an ability which is inactive until you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, then it turns on and becomes active for the rest of the game. For example, Krosan Beast is a 1/1 for 4 mana, but if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, its Threshold ability turns on, giving it +7/+7. Flashback, meanwhile, is a mechanic which goes on instants and sorceries, and allows them to be cast again from a graveyard, usually for an increased cost. For example, Firebolt is a cheap burn spell, which can be cast for 1 mana, and then cast again for 5 mana from the graveyard. So I've introduced the two new mechanics from Odyssey, but what card will I be using to represent the set? Wild Mongrel is a card with neither of the mechanics, but which enables both. Wild Mongrel allows you to discard a card from your hand to give it +1/+1 until the end of turn. Ooh, it also changes colour, which is cool, I guess. Wild Mongrel was used in tournament decks of the time, and players would just dump their hands into their graveyard in order to meet Threshold as fast as possible. Mark Rosewater has talked about how he dislikes this, and looking back, dislikes the design of Odyssey more broadly. In an episode of his Drive to Work podcast, where he talks about designing this set, he argues,
So anyway, one of the problems with Odyssey was it kind of made you do some stuff that if you understood what was going on, I used to say that Odyssey may be one of the spiky sets we ever made. Because if you understood, oh, I see, I need to throw away cards because that actually is advantageous. And, oh, it's interesting. Oh, card advantage doesn't work, That if you understand the nuances. But the problem was that I made a set that, you had to be very experienced to even understand what was going on. And the low-end user, it was not fun for them. And so that was one of the big problems with Odyssey, one of the lessons of Odyssey. But at the time, we were trying to enable Threshold and Flashback. And so one of the ways that we did that was, gave you a lot of ways to get cards in your graveyard.
So to conclude, Odyssey was a graveyard set, designed with the intention of subverting the notion of card advantage. Mark Rosewater, Magic the Gathering's current chief designer, has stated that he dislikes how this makes the set overly complex and intellectual, which turns off newer players. Future graveyard sets learn the lesson of Odyssey and continue to advance its themes whilst being more approachable. In February 2002, Torment was released. Torment furthered the graveyard themes of Odyssey by introducing the new Madness mechanic. Cards with Madness can be cast when they are discarded from your hand, entering play rather than the graveyard, just so long as you pay their Madness cost. Notably, every single card with Madness in Torment has a Madness cost which is either lower or equal to its regular mana cost, meaning that it's always advantageous to play a card through Madness. This has the effect of making decks featuring Wild Mongrel even more powerful, as the dog now provided you with an opportunity to discard as many cards as you wanted, at any time that you wanted, whilst also giving the Mongrel +1/+1. You can bring out as many Basking Root Wallers as were in your hand, and buff your Mongrel at the same time, enabling you to establish a wide board state whilst also swinging in for very big damage. Just as an aside, from a flavour perspective, I have no clue why Basking Root Waller has Madness. This little lizard is adorable, not insane. But introducing Madness isn't the primary thing which makes Torment notable. No, Torment is unique in the history of the game because it attempted to skew the colour pie in one colour's favour. Torment was designed as a set where the colour black would be emphasised. All of the starter decks newer players could buy from stores featured black as one of their colours. The card Cabal Coffers offered you a powerful incentive to build mono black decks. Normally, the number of cards per colour in each set is roughly balanced. That's not the case for Torment, which features 40 black cards, 28 blue and red cards, and only 21 white and green cards. It's notable that white and green saw the fewest printed cards in this set, as they're black's enemy colours, a concept we discussed in the previous episode of this series. From the perspective of the storyline, this was designed to show the growing strength of the Cabal, the antagonistic faction of the Mirari saga, who were aligned with black mana. The card which I'm using to summarise this set demonstrates its focus on black cards. Tainted Field is a land which has two effects. Either it adds 1 colourless mana to your mana pool, or 1 white or black mana to your mana pool, if you have a swamp. This card was designed to show how the influence of black magic was increasing, and its power was seeping into the other lands of Dominaria. Tainted Fields is part of a cycle, including Tainted Isle, Tainted Peak, and Tainted Wood, all of which are corrupted versions of the basic lands, which have been infused with black mana. For obvious reasons, there is no Tainted Swamp, making this cycle partially incomplete. Speaking of partially incomplete cycles, there's also a 4-card cycle of possessed creatures in every colour but black, each of which became black and gained the ability to destroy other cards of their original colour once you reach threshold. These, like the Tainted Lands, demonstrate the growing influence of the Cabal on black magic. But this was not to last. After Torment came Judgment. In May 2002, whilst continuing the Graveyard Matters theme prevalent through Odyssey block, Judgment flipped the black-centric theme of Torment on its head. As the Cabal began to lose influence, black's enemy colours, white and green, began to grow in power. Judgment featured only 16 black cards, 27 blue and red cards, and 33 green and white cards. Also, in a reverse of Torment, absolutely none of the starter decks from Judgment featured black at all. Fittingly, I suppose, we'll use a green card to represent Judgment, but before I talk about that card, I need to talk about a card from 1993. Ring of Maroof is a card from Arabian Nights. It allows you to pay 5 mana, tap and exile it, in order to put a card you own from outside the game into your hand, rather than drawing a card at the start of your turn. The Ring of Maroof, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm horribly butchering that pronunciation, contains a genie. When you use the card, you are, thematically at least, making a wish to the ring, which is granted to you in the form of popping a card you own from outside of the game into your hand. So you can make a wish for just the right card to get you out of whatever your current predicament is. This effect was paid homage in a cycle of cards from Judgment, known as the Wish Cycle, including the card we'll be using to represent the set, Living Wish. Living Wish allows you to pay 2 mana in order to place a creature or land from outside the game into your hand. The rest of the Wish Cycle from Judgment allows you to wish for cards of other card types, except for the black card, Death Wish, which lets you wish for any kind of card, just so long as you punch yourself on the face afterwards and lose half of your life. Cards which let you fetch other cards from outside the game, from this point onwards, have always been referred to as Wish cards, both officially and unofficially. These cards are still coming out today. Just look at Fae of Wishes, released as recently as Throne of Eldraine. Wish cards are slightly unique, because their effects differ depending on whether you use them in a tournament or in casual play. In a casual game, a wish works as its text would imply. You can grab any card you own, or any card from your binder, and pop it into your hand. In a tournament, however, outside of the game, is restricted only to the 15 cards in your sideboard, making these cards significantly more balanced, but also significantly less cool. So Judgment codified the concept of wish cards, which had earlier been established in Arabian Nights, and introduced the term wish to describe their effects. I've talked before about tribal sets where a card's creature type matters. Fallen Empires tried to be a tribal set, but just had too many factions for it all to work properly, and for the theme to be executed with any degree of coherence. Mercadian Masks had tribal elements, with rebels and mercenary decks, but it's hard to really describe it as a full-on tribal set. Now, Onslaught, released in October 2002, is the first unambiguous tribal set in the game. The eponymous set of Onslaught block begins the story of a gradually escalating war on the continent of Otaria between several groups. Goblins, which are printed in red, elves in green, zombies in black, soldiers in white, and wizards in blue. Does that seem like it'd be simple and just result in mono-coloured decks? Well, that's not all Onslaught has to offer. There were also beasts, which are available in red and green, birds, who are available in white and blue, and clerics, who are available in black and white. There are also some blue illusions, which are every creature type. Ooh, and some creatures crisscrossed multiple tribes. There were elven wizards, zombie goblins, and bird clerics, among others. Compare this to a more modern tribal set, like Ixalan. Perhaps it does seem a bit more chaotic and unstructured, but then perhaps that's part of the appeal. Ixalan's draft experience was often criticised for being too on rails, and forcing you into certain tribes and archetypes when you'd only gotten 1 or 2 cards. Onslaught's more chaotic structure means you have more freedom to make your picks and to determine your strategy. The card which we'll be using to summarise Onslaught is Goblin Taskmaster. First of all, because it's a relevant creature type. It's a goblin. Goblin decks had existed since way back in Alpha. Goblin King made sure of that, but they'd never really been terribly viable. That all changed with the release of Onslaught, which made tribal decks of all sorts finally good. I mean, you probably wouldn't be using Goblin Taskmaster, it's a pretty terrible card. You'd be running cards like Goblin Piledriver or Sparksmith instead. But I've chosen to flag up Goblin Taskmaster because on top of being a goblin, it has a mechanic which is one of Onslaught's greatest innovations, Morph. A card with Morph can be played face down for 3 mana of any colour. It can then be flipped face up at any time by paying its Morph cost, which varies depending on the card in question. Morph cards usually have a surprising effect or do something special when they're revealed, allowing you to take your opponent by surprise. In Goblin Taskmaster's case, it has a rather lame ability to give another goblin extra strength for 2 mana, which could theoretically take an unaware opponent by very mild surprise, I guess. Some more exciting Morph cards have abilities like Death Touch, meaning your opponent will regret blocking them because their blocker will die, or the ability to deal half of your opponent's life in damage if they hit them, which will make your opponent regret not blocking them. Morph adds an element of surprise to games and requires pro players to try and learn all of the potential Morph cards their opponent could be running in a given format whenever they see a face down card. Morph is especially impactful in a tribal set like Onslaught, because opponents won't be able to tell if the face down card you've just played benefits from all of the tribal synergies you have on the board, or if you're just trying to bluff them. Just a quick note before we move on here. Recently, the Tasty Cardboard, another Magic the Gathering YouTuber, made a fantastic video on Onslaught block, which I'd thoroughly recommend checking out. In February 2003, Legions marched out to stores. Now Legions is a set which is entirely unique in the history of the game, as it contains only creatures. If you were to crack open a Legions pack, you wouldn't find any instants, sorceries, artifacts, enchantments, or lands. I mean, or planeswalkers, I guess, but there wouldn't be any planeswalkers in any of the packs we've talked about so far. Anyway, only creatures. Legions continued to build upon the tribal theme of Onslaught block, and it also brought slivers back to the game, so players could try experimenting with them. The most notable card from Legions, however, didn't belong to any of the tribal creature types it was pushing. Akroma, Angel of Wrath, is an 8 mana 6/6 with the abilities Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, Haste, Protection from Black, and Protection from Red. In her time, Akroma was considered a hugely powerful card, simply due to the power provided by having so many different effects all at once. She was sort of the questing beast of her day. She has such an insane number of abilities that she even slightly bends the colour pie. Both then and now, white cards shouldn't really have Trample, and they definitely shouldn't have Haste. Due to the fact that she possesses Flying and Trample, it's very hard to prevent damage from Akroma from coming through. Vigilance means she could defend and attack, and First Strike makes her difficult to deal with through combat. Having protection from black and red also makes her hard to remove outside of combat, as 2 colours with excellent removal spells are completely unable to target her. In her time, Akroma was a terrifying threat. She earned a place in many Pro Tour and Grand Prix decks as a powerful finisher to close out the game. These days, however, cards like Akroma have significantly decreased in viability. As time has passed, more and more viable cards have been printed at lower and lower mana costs. I compared Akroma to Questing Beasts earlier, and that's an apt analogy. Even in formats like Standard, with very small card pools, win conditions these days tend to cost significantly less than 8 mana. Questing Beast only costs 4 mana, and will probably see significantly less play if both its cost and power were amped up to 6. Hell, Doom Whisperer is a 5 mana 6/6 with Flying, Trample, and the ability to let you control the top card of your deck, and it's barely impacted Standard at all. The game has simply gotten too fast, and lowest cost creatures have simply gotten too strong for cards like Akroma to see play anymore. I would say use her in your commander decks, where giant threats tend to be more useful, but then Zetulpa, Primal Dawn from Ixalan, sort of crept in and stole her niche, costing the same as her, but providing probably an overall higher level of power, due to having double strike and indestructibility, which, in most cases, though not always, is better than having protection from only 2 colours. Zetulpa doesn't have haste though, I guess, so maybe there is still room for Akroma. Akroma is one of the game's most iconic cards, and has left a lasting legacy. In the 2003 Xbox game, Magic the Gathering Battlegrounds, she was the most powerful white duelist. Out of interest, does anyone else remember Magic the Gathering Battlegrounds, or was that game just a weird fever dream I had? Time Spiral Block, a series of sets which paid homage to Magic's past, reference Akroma twice, with an alternative universe red version of her, Akroma Angel of Fury, and an artifact entitled Akroma's Memorial, which gives all of your creatures the same collection of abilities which she possesses. Akroma's Memorial bears the same flavour text as the original card, her famous mantra, no rest, no mercy, no matter what. If I were to ask you, what's the coolest kind of fantasy creature, what would your answer be? Now some of you might have said Minotaurs, and that's a good answer. Some of you might have said elves, or goblins, or zombies, and those are all great answers too. But I feel like most of you here probably answered dragons, and market research conducted by Wizards of the Coast repeatedly indicates that dragons have pretty much always been the most popular creature type in the game. So in May 2003, they brought out Scourge, a whole dragon-themed set. Or at least, that's what their marketing claimed it was. I mean, look, even the logo's a dragon. Surely the set must be loaded with them. Well, not really. Of the 143 cards in Scourge, 4 were dragons. Admittedly, there were a few extra cards in the set which played into this theme, like the enchantment, Form of the Dragon, which thematically turns its controller into a dragon, and Dragon Speaker Shaman, a goblin who makes any dragons you summon cheaper. One of these cards is the card which I'll be using to represent the set, Dragonstorm, because it represents both of Scourge's themes. Dragons, kinda, like I've already mentioned, and the brand new Storm mechanic. Only a handful of Storm cards exist. The only standard legal sets they were ever printed in were Scourge and Time Spiral, and none will ever be printed into standard again. There is in fact a term used by Magic's designers called the Storm Scale, which dictates how likely a mechanic is to be used again in a standard legal set. A 1 on the Storm Scale indicates a mechanic like Trample or Flying, which will be printed in every single set, and a 10 belongs to a mechanic which will never be reprinted again. This scale is named after the mechanic Storm, which is the definitive number 10 rated mechanic. So just what is Storm, and what's the problem with it? A card with Storm casts a copy of itself for every single spell played prior to it in a given turn. So let's use Dragonstorm here as an example. If I cast 2 spells in a turn, and then I cast Dragonstorm, it copies itself twice, for a total of 3 iterations, allowing you to fetch 3 dragons from your deck and bring them into play. So why is this an issue? Well, if you build a deck around it, it can be very, very easy to abuse the Storm mechanic, and get your Storm count absurdly high, absurdly fast. Cards like Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual allow you to increase your Storm count, whilst also net increasing the amount of mana you have available. If you combine that with very cheap card draw, like Opt and Serum Visions, then you can quickly draw through your deck to get to your Storm card whilst increasing your Storm count and keeping sufficient mana to cast the card once you get it. Although Grape Shot might seem unassuming, it can quickly spiral out of control in these circumstances and deal 20 or more damage, especially because Storm cards work very well with other Storm cards, given that they cast so many iterations of themselves, and thus further raise your Storm count. As anybody who's played Pioneer before the Inverter of Truth ban can attest, the format's no fun if it's loaded full of combo decks, so Storm, Scourge's greatest contribution to the game, was ultimately swept out of standard. It is pretty fun to try and build Storm decks in Cube and Modern though. Well, here we are at the end of the video, but also at the end of an era. 8th edition was released in July 2003. It brought the most major change in the presentation of Magic the Gathering cards that there's ever been. No more would cards look like this, but now they look like this. This still isn't exactly how cards look today. Core Set 2015, which, contrary to its name, was actually released in 2014, fiddled around with the frames a bit more, but certainly these cards look much more modern. 8th edition marks the beginning of the modern era of the game, in fact, and fittingly enough, the beginning of the modern format. At some point, I might make a side video, related to but separate from this series, talking about the history of formats, but for now, what matters is that 8th edition transformed the game's artwork in a major way, and, at least in my opinion, made Magic the Gathering cards look much slicker. As 8th edition contains only reprinted cards, we won't be looking at it as a part of this series, but we will be looking at the first 2 blocks in the modern format. Mirrodin, which focuses on artifacts and features a slew of incredibly powerful affinity decks, and Kamigawa block, a world with a devout fanbase inspired by Japanese mythology. We're moving further along now. We've covered 10 years of Magic the Gathering's history already, and I can't wait to cover the rest. I'll see you all next time.